Welcome back. Today we're actually going to get into our last thematic lesson, which is about the role of religion and especially religious extremism in Central Asia. Some of this is going to be sort of a review of some of the stuff we've covered, and then I'll introduce new elements as we bring it up to the contemporary period. So the big intro question here is, why might we expect or not expect radical Islam to be popular in post-Soviet Central Asia? We can start by looking at what religion was, the role of religion under the Soviet period. Remember that the Soviets despised Islam for a number of reasons. Ideologically, it, as well as all other religions, were the opiate of the masses, but Islam was much more ingrained in the social structures. So the Soviets went out to emancipate women, to throw off the veil, and somehow shut down the mosques and all that sort of stuff. But the Soviets also feared the creation of a pan-Islamic and pan-Turkic identity that could oppose them. So again, you didn't have this sort of pan-Christian identity that was feared in other parts of the Soviet Union, but you did have this pan-Islamic identity that was feared. Another issue here is that Islam makes no distinction between religion and politics. So you've got these cross-cutting ties, political, social, and economic ties. Islam's involved in politics. Remember, during the Emirs, it was also involved in economics. And also in broader social identification. Which brings me to the last point, which is that Islam is not merely a religion, but it's a way of life. You don't necessarily need to be very religious to be a Muslim. It's much more about traditions and self-identification. Central Asians were never big on prayer 5 times a day, but they're Muslims by self-identification. So what happened to the strength and organizational structure of Islam under the Soviet period? Well, we've talked about this. It took on many forms. There was official Islam, but then there was also the parallel or underground Islam that was tolerated by Muslim leaders, by the official Muslim leaders. There was also the Islam of the population, which was more symbolic. People would engage in these sort of ceremonies. And then there's the Islam of modernized Muslim elites who took pride, especially during the period of nationalism in the 1980s. They took pride based on the feeling of national religiousness. And all this made it really easy for a rebound of religion in the 1980s, of traditions and festivals which came into public view. And by this point, it was clear that religion wasn't just for the uneducated and downtrodden, like the Soviet powers had always said, for the ignorant, but that everyone was in on it, including the Communist Party leaders. I mentioned earlier that often Communist Party elites would appear to be anti-Islam, but then upon retirement, they would show their true colors and they would go to mosques regularly. But remember, keep in mind that what you have left in the Soviet period, after the Soviet period, is very limited and almost symbolic Islam, a knowledge of the religion. It's very symbolic knowledge of the religion. People know a few rituals, but they continue to practice these. There's a type of identification, but they're mixed with Soviet customs. So, for example, the vodka drinking that goes on, which isn't really traditional in a Muslim context. Because alcohol is banned. In Central Asia, polygamy was mostly gone by the end of the Soviet period. You have daily prayer that's only really engaged in by a few old people, including my host grandmother in Samarkand. Alcohol is big. Intermarriage is rare, though. And so birth, death, and life events are still religious. Women are oriented towards the family. So another element of religion. Again, when we think of Central Asia, think of acculturation rather than assimilation. People adopted Sovietization, but they didn't accept it. And so Islam continued to play a major role in sort of the underpinnings of society. So what's the role of Islamic elites under the post-Soviet system? Where do these interests match and clash with political elites? Remember, we talked about various types of elites, and just a quick review. Ruling political elites often allied themselves with official Islamic leaders in order to help maintain control, especially as these systems became once again more repressive with the decline of the Soviet Union and independence. The opposition political elites would sometimes ally themselves with official Islam, but also unofficial Islamic leaders, hoping that they could use these as a link to the population, to the local communities where there's real power. And these weren't fundamentalists. These were people who wanted Islam in general, but not necessarily through a radical Islamic takeover. Historically, there's been since the 1990s, there's been a very tense relationship as political elites have leaned on, but also feared losing their grip on Islamic powers. And in particular, the tension comes from official political elites, those who are in power, and all sorts of Islam. They want to use them, but they don't want to lose control to them. And all this sort of gives birth to this rhetoric of anti-fundamentalism, this extremism. So the Central Asians, especially in Uzbekistan, to some degree, and in Tajikistan, to some degree in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, and then Turkmenistan, probably the least arguably in Turkmenistan, but it's harder to get information from there, have played up the threat of fundamentalism, coming up with lots of evidence and lots of theories about how the fundamentalists are knocking on our doors. They're in our midst right now, and they're trying to create an Islamic State, which most post-Soviet Central Asians are probably not in favor of. Although there's a caveat, we'll get to that in a second. How do you measure popular understandings and favoritism towards this? So what tends to happen in Central Asia is that Central Asian leaders point to the south, Afghanistan, Tajikistan earlier on, but Afghanistan today, and they play up very occasional infiltrations of radical Islamist groups that come across the borders, for example, into Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan in particular, and launch these military incursions. And they get played up in the media as a major threat. It's unclear if, we're talking about 10, 20, 30, 50 people or 10,000, but really it tends to be much closer to 10, 20, 30, 50 people who go across the border and launch attacks against the regimes. Occasionally you've got suicide bombings, but these are trumpeted again as a sign of growing radical Islam, growing quote-unquote radical Islam. And you find this actually in the scholarly literature as well as the media, where everyone talks about this growing threat. But we don't have a lot of evidence, which I'll get to in a second. But again, in the mid-2000s, for example, in Uzbekistan, you had a bombing of the Israeli embassy, you had a bombing of the U.S. embassy. These occurred in the run-up to elections. You had a bombing in Bukhara, which was out of the capital, so that they could show that this happens everywhere. And many are convinced that the Uzbek government's actually behind this. So there are these conspiracy theories that go all over the place. Well, why would they be? Well, when you think about it, they're doing this for two populations. Their domestic population. During the elections, this is a great time. This is a great way to ban the opposition, saying that they're in line with these Islamists who are a real threat. It's also a great way to show that we can provide security. We're clamping down on these guys, but we need your help. We don't need messy democratic politics. And then in terms of a foreign audience, they can say, hey, look, we've got the same problems that you have, Russia. We've got the same problems you have, U.S. So let's all ally ourselves together. And China. Don't forget to throw China in there. So what are some problems with studying Islamism, Islamist extremism in Central Asia? Well, one is, how do you define it? Is it those who want an Islamic State? Or is it those who want an Islamic State only through terrorism? In other words, what about those who want an Islamic State through democratic means? Well, they've also been branded extremists in Central Asia. You also have major measurement problems. It's difficult to carry out research on these topics. The government's obviously very sensitive to it. They're the ones who are playing up the Islamic threat, and they don't want to be exposed as lying, or they've got this evidence and they want it to be a big issue. And so they don't want to back down from that, since it's fundamental to their domestic and their foreign policies. Now, once you get in and begin to carry out research, trying to figure out where the population looks at this and how the population understands this, that's also really difficult. If you're looking for the extent of radical Islam, you could carry out large surveys. But in a repressive society, you're going to find people who don't want to admit that they're pro-radicalism, even if they are. And you're going to find people who don't want to admit that they're anti-radicalism, even if they are. Because there's this dilemma. If you're involved in a radical Islamic group, you don't want to get out information that radical Islamic group doesn't have support. You want to identify with it and show that as many people as possible are identifying with it, so that other people think, oh, well, then I can identify with it too. It's not so risky. On the other hand, you don't want to do the opposite either, and and say that that they're everywhere, because this could only validate what the regime is saying. So it's very difficult, even among Islamist extremists, to get to get real information. There's also trying to get more popular understandings. People have very different ideas of what these organizations represent, given the lack of information in Central Asia. So if you ask people if they support, for example, a group that's labeled radical Islamists like Hizb ut-Tahrir, they might well be thinking of different organizational qualities. They might not know that it's a radical organization. They might think it's more radical than it is. So popular understandings are themselves structured by the limited opportunities for free speech in these countries. And probably then finally you've got the problem of self-identification, which I alluded to a second ago. Even among admitted members, the organizations themselves tend not to want to talk about how many numbers they actually have, because if they give low numbers, then they seem weak. If they give high numbers, then they validate government concerns and tactics. So all these are a problem. So let's think of some reasons. Well, I'll take this in a separate set of slides.